Hi, my name is Mark Plowski. I'm from WebH Solutions, and I'll be delivering this webinar today on routing and navigation with the React Router. During the webinar, if you have any questions, the best way to get my attention is to ask them in the question interface in GoToWebinar. So you should see that as part of the interface. Go there, ask a question, and I'll keep an eye on that on my second screen. And when questions come in, I'll either answer them as soon as I can or defer them. I'll let you know when I'll be answering them. So the first thing I want to go through is the topics. Okay, we're going to be talking about routing and navigation. Okay, as you know, React is a framework that's used to create components. Okay, so it doesn't naturally have a way to move between those components. You can add components together so they show on the same screen. Okay, but React doesn't include the router portion. So to do that, we'll be using a related package called React Router. Okay. We'll show how to set up the dev environment to most effectively create React Router-based applications. We'll talk about the router and the routes and other elements that you need to add into your components in order to allow them to route. We'll talk about route and query parameters. Okay, and then we'll have a short piece of information about routing with Redux. Okay, so the way this is going to unfold is that we're going to go through a chapter of information on this topic, which should take maybe 20 minutes or so, and then we'll get into a demonstration. In the demonstration, we'll go through creating an application, adding some components to it, and then routing those components. So we'll do that from scratch once we get through the chapter. Okay. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the chapter now. Okay. Give me a second to adjust my screen. Okay. Okay, so this is a list of the topics that I was talking about. Let's get right into it. Okay, so your applications are generally going to consist of more than one view, right? So you'll have a component. Give me one second. You'll have a component that's your main component. And then within that component, you're going to want to move between different views. Okay, so this will look to the user as if they're on different pages. Okay, so that's the effect that you're looking for. Okay, you have two pieces of this when it comes down to programming it. One is routing. Okay, routing is where you define the possible transitions. You define what pages can be viewed and what the paths are in the URL that represent those pages. Okay, when you create your routing, this generally happens at design time, and it involves this definition of routes, which we'll take a look at. Then the other half of this is navigation. So once you have routes, which are potential places for you to move to, then at runtime, you're going to navigate between your various components using navigational links. Okay, so navigational links are defined at design time and used at runtime. In order to do this with React components, we're going to use the React Router package. Now, React Router package has gone through some changes recently. In the most recent iteration of it, you have these various packages that can be used: React Router DOM, and the other one's listed here. React Router is the core package. Okay, it's actually included in the other packages. Okay, so you're generally not or no longer going to import the React Router itself, because when we import another package like the React Router DOM, the React Router itself is going to be included in that. Okay, and React Router DOM is the one that we're going to be using for working with web applications. Okay. So to create a React Router-based project, you could, of course, create your development environment from scratch, but one of the most effective ways to do this is to use Create React App, which is an application that's used to just, start up your React development, and installs all the different files that you need. Okay, all you need to do is install the Create React App, and then do this, let's see, then you would do Create React App and then the name of your app name. Okay. So once you have that, you have a basic setup for React development, but it doesn't yet include the React Router. Okay, so that's what you do in the next step. So onto that existing setup, you'll install the React Router DOM package. Okay, that'll be added into your package.json file, so it'll be available there. Okay. And then when you're inside of your components, you'll see that you need to import specific pieces from that React Router DOM. So you'll be importing things like this: browser router, route, link. In other cases, you'll be importing switch and Nav Link. Okay, that's usually the set of components that you need to import. Okay, so here's an example of a basic application that is doing some routing. It starts off with a header, just this basic routing app. Then there's a nav section, which includes some buttons. In this case, these buttons are actually anchor tags styled as buttons. And then you have underneath that the part that's going to be changing. So when you click on About, you see the About component at the bottom. When you click on Home, you see the Home component at the bottom. Okay. So for that basic routed component that you see, this is how it would be set up, or this is one of the ways it can be set up. Okay, the first thing you need to do is you need to wrap your application in browser router. Okay, so you've imported that, and then here you're wrapping it around this div. Okay, browser router can only have one child. Okay, which is the reason why you're embedding a div underneath it, because that div then can hold as many things as you need. But if you try directly inside of browser router to add two separate routes without wrapping it in a div, you'll get some errors because it's not meant to be used that way. Here we've also separated out the navigation section to another component called page nav. You don't have to do that. It's just done here, so it makes it easier to display what we're talking about. The first thing that we're talking about is not going to be the navigation, so we're going to concentrate here on this section. Okay, and section here just it can be a div, or it can be a section, or any type of HTML element. Okay, so there's nothing special about it being a section. Okay, but what is special is these two routes. Okay. You have the first route, which has a path of the root path, and that's going to point to your home component. So what that means is that when the URL in the address bar has a path at the end of it that's just the root path, then this route is going to be activated, and the home component is going to be shown in place of this route. The next one is route of about. So when the URL in the address bar shows about, then this about component is going to be shown. Okay, and so what happens here is with either of these, if the path does not match the actual path in the address bar, then the route is not shown, or the component for the route is not shown. Okay. In this case, the two paths are mutually exclusive because of the exact here. You're saying only pull up the path here that is the root component, but not everything after it. Okay. So that's the basics of routing. Okay. If we're going to take a look at some more of the code, here's some additional code for that. This first part is what we just saw. Okay. Page nav is going to have some links, which we'll explain in a couple pages. Then we go down here, we have a home component, and we have an about component. And these are just very basic components. You would, in your own application, have more full-featured components in their places. Okay. Now, when you import the browser router, you can import it like that, but a lot of times in code, you'll see it look like this. The import will be browser router as router. Okay, so you're creating an alias for browser router. What that means then is in your JSX code, instead of saying browser router here, you say router. Okay, so that's important to know because some example code will do this, and you may be wondering where browser router is, and it's right there. It's just being aliased. Okay, so the route component, we talked about it briefly when we looked at that first page. It has a path, okay, which it's looking to match with the address bar, what's in the address bar. So for example, if we have a route with the path equal stuff, naturally that is going to match a URL with this /stuff or /stuff more or /stuff more 1. Okay, it's going to match everything that starts with that path. Now that may not be what you want. What you want may be only to have it match the first part of it, or stuff, and that's possible. Okay, you just need to add exact into your route. Okay, so exact is going to say only match this path. Don't match any of the subpaths that could be possibly beyond that. Okay, those you would then create other routes for. So if you wanted to route to stuff/more, you'd create a second route for that. Okay, or stuff/more 1, you create a route for that. Okay, the other part of the route is the component which you want to invoke or show if that path has been matched. Okay. Now, it's possible, based on how you set up these routes, that more than one route could possibly be invoked. Okay, and in order to avoid that, okay, if you want your routes to be mutually exclusive, meaning you only want one of the routes in the set to match, okay, then one, you either need to make sure that the paths are mutually exclusive, or if that's not possible based on what you're setting up, you need to wrap them in a switch element. A switch element is part of React Router DOM. Okay, and what this is going to do is it's going to say, out of all the routes that are inside of switch, only choose one of them. Okay, choose the first one that matches. So that lets you do something like this. Add a path at the end that matches all routes. So what happens in this case is that it goes through and it checks the first path. Does the URL match the path of the root? Okay. If it doesn't match that, it goes down and sees if it has about on it. If it doesn't match that, then it drops down to the last one, which in this case is being used as a default path, and that matches any other path. Okay. So if you typed in about and you misspelled it, for example, or you typed in a route that was not set up here in the route section, then it would be matched by this, and you could then send that to a default or an error component. Usually going to pop up a component there that says you've inserted a route that's not valid. Okay, and that would be a message to the user. Okay, so So if you find that you've set up your routes without switch and they're acting a little bit funny, or they're not acting the way you expect, a lot of times adding switch around it will fix that issue. There's another route that you can use. It's the redirect. Okay, so it's not technically a route element, it's a redirect element. And what it does is it takes a look at the path in the URL, and if it matches the from, okay, then what it does is it redirects to this other path that's mentioned here. Okay, so in this case, what we're saying is if it matches the route exactly and only the route, then redirect that to home, and then the home path will be invoked. Okay. Okay, so what you'll see is that if you type in just the URL without anything on the end of it, it will automatically add home to it. Okay, that's what you'll see, but it'll happen quickly. Okay, now we need to talk about links also. So once you've set up your routes, then you have a possibility to go to different places in your application, okay, or to show different components. Okay, but those components, and you can actually do that navigation by just going up to the address bar and adding whatever the path is right in the address bar. Okay, but you're not going to want your users to have to do that. Your users are going to expect to have some kind of buttons or links in order to click on them to go between your different components. So to do that, you add link elements, and these link elements need to be within the router element. Okay. So once you set up a link, you set up a to. To is going to be the piece of or a fragment that's added to the end of the URL. Okay. So here it's adding the root fragment. Here it's adding about to the end of the URL. Okay. When it does that, that will then trigger the routing, or trigger it to go through and check the routes, and it will then display the specific component. Okay, so in this case, the user has to click on the link in order to invoke that. Okay, now there's another trigger that you can put on there. Is you can use this word replace in your link. Okay, so what the replace is for has to do with the browser's history, right? So the browser history is a list that the browser keeps, not your application, but the browser itself, that keeps of the history of what's been in the address bar. Okay, and what's been in the address bar should uniquely point to specific pages. Okay, so that's what enables the browser to let you use the back button. Okay, use the back button, it goes through the history stack back, and it just replaces the URL with a new URL from the back stack, you know, from this history object. But when you're navigating forward, you have a choice. Do I want to, you know, when I navigate to a new screen, say I'm on screen A, I'm going to screen B, do I want to take the current screen and add it to the history before I go to screen B? And that's what replace does here. What it does is it lets you affect how that works. So in this case, instead of adding A to the history, it'll just go to B, and it won't modify the history yet until you go to the next page. Okay, so it's going to replace it rather than give a new entry for it. So the idea here is, for example, if you have a multi-page form, say, you might not want to change the URL as people go through the first page of questions to the next page of questions. Okay, that might not be what you want. You want just either them to be in the multi-page form or not. Okay, so you might use something like replace in that case. Okay. Now there's another type of link called Nav Link. This is the one you'll probably wind up using most often. The difference between link and Nav Link is just that when you use Nav Link, the router package is going to add a class to the button that you clicked, okay, or to the link that you clicked. And then you can style that particular class. So in this case, if I change this home button to a Nav Link, okay, then when I click on it, as you might see here, it's a little bit hard to see, but it's actually bold and in green. Okay, that's because when you clicked on it, the router added the active class to its list of classes for that button, and then you added this, or the developer added an active class to their CSS style sheet. Okay, now you can change this to whatever type of style you want. You can make it look like it's been pressed, or you can change the font, or this is just the most minimal thing, just kind of changing the font weight, making it bold. Okay, if I use Nav Link for both the home and the about, then when I click on about, the home will stop being styled and the about will be styled. Okay. So what this does is it lets you see, without looking at the address bar, what route you're on. Okay. Now, one of the other things you might want to do is to add route parameters. Route parameters are pieces of data that are needed by the component that you're routing to. Okay. So for example, if you're on a products page, which is a list of products, and you have a list there, and you want to click on an item in the list, say the third item in the list, and go to the detail page for that item, okay, you need to set up the path in the route to accept some extra data. In this case, we're accepting the index value. Okay? So whatever the index value is of that third item, if it's an array index, you can just use the number 4. You can pass that or add that on to the route, and then that will when you do that in the link, it will be transferred into the index element here in the route. Okay, and it'll be available to the detail component, this product detail component, when you open the product detail component. Here the example shows what looks like a product number, P0001. So that's what's going to be passed in index. Okay, so this is the part where you set up the route parameter. Okay, the next part, well, there's two things, right? You're setting up the route parameter here. When you click on a link, you're adding a piece of data to the 2 here so that it can match that route. And then in the detail component, you're going to have to read that piece of data in order to put that detail information up on the screen. Okay, so the way to do that, or to retrieve that route parameter, okay, is in your component. This is going to be added to your properties or your parameters, okay, as match. Okay, so in addition to all the other properties that you have, here it's called params, it's the same thing. So this is your properties. Okay, so along with the other properties that you have being passed into the product detail component, now the router is going to add match params to that. Match params is going to be an object that includes, in this case, index, which is the router parameter. So that's how you're going to retrieve your index, okay, by adding match.params.index to your properties. You get the value, and then you can go and you can look up your value. In this case, we've got the value in a products array, so we're just going to pass the index, get the selected product, and now we can show that information on the screen from that selected object. Okay, the other type of parameters you might be interested in are query string parameters. Query string parameters are also added to the end of the URL, but they look like this, right? So just say you have a path of send mail. Okay, then after that, a question mark, and then you have some name value pairs. Name equals mark, ampersand, email equals, and then an email address. Okay. So these would be called query string parameters. And whenever you have the question mark, that's, you know that you're starting off with the query string. The query string is separate from the route, okay, which means that you don't have to add anything to the route in order to collect or use these query string parameters. As opposed to when you use the route parameters that we saw on the previous page, you had to add index to the route parameter. And in that case, the index value, that piece of data that you're adding onto the end of the URL, would be required for it to match the route. Okay. In this case, with query string parameters, the route will be matched with or without query string parameters. So if you leave off the query string altogether, it'll match, in this case, the send mail route. If you add query parameters, it'll still match that same route. Okay, so that's a big difference between these and route parameters. Okay, so here we just have a regular route. In this case, let's see, I think this, we're trying to match send mail. So this looks like a typo. It should be send mail here, going to the send mail component. So this link up here would match this with send mail in the path. But then the question is, when we get to that component, the component that we are routing to, how do we get the value of the this query string? So the way you do that is on your properties, there'll be a location object, and on that location object there'll be a search object. And that search object is the query string parameters, which are sometimes called search parameters, and it retrieves the entire query string. Okay, it doesn't parse it. Okay, in the previous version of the router, that was parsed for you. In this version, it's not. So you need to parse that yourself. You can do that like this. Here we're getting the query string, and we're going to parse it using this method here, URL search params. Okay, so most browsers have URL search params as part of their, they support it natively. If you're working with browsers that don't support URL search params natively, then you'll have to use a third-party library, and there are some available that are just query string reading parameters libraries. They'll read the query string and parse it for you and create an object out of it. And that's what's happening here. We pass in the query string, and here we get an object called params, which then has a method called get. And you can use get and ask it for the different parameters. Here we're asking for name, here we're asking for email, and that's how you retrieve the individual values. Okay. So the last thing in this chapter part that we're going to look at has to do with using the router with Redux. So if you're creating a React application and it uses Redux, which is a way of managing state in your application and using actions and reducers in order to modify state. Okay, so that's a popular way of using React. But when you use that, what you generally do is you wrap this provider element, which is part of Redux, or actually React Redux. You wrap that around your application, and then it passes the store and makes the state available to the application elements. Okay? But remember, when we're doing our routing, we need to wrap our application, or at least the root part of our application, with router or with browser router. Okay? So at first you might think that that's a problem, that you have one wrapping and then the other wrapping, but they work together just fine. Okay, so all you do is in this case, you wrap everything in router, and then that you wrap in provider. Okay, and that will let you use Redux. Now, one thing about this is that when it works like this, the router is going to be managing the URL and the location that you're currently pointing to by the URL. That location is not going to be part of the state of the application when you do it in the way that you see here. Okay? If you need to pull that into your application and make the state manageable by your application, then you would wind up using another package mentioned here, React Router Redux. Okay? And the main purpose of React Router Redux is to let or move the state into the application, okay? And the main benefit of doing that is that you can do something called time travel with React applications, which means you can kind of go back a couple steps in what the user did and see exactly what the screen should be like and what the state of the application should be. It should all match. Okay. Once you add the router, normally you can still go back in a React application, but it won't include any route changes. Okay. So if you need to use that particular tool to do time travel to troubleshoot your applications and things like that, then you might want to look into the React Router Redux package. There's some extra setup that you have to do in order to make it work, but once it's set up, then that enables that extra troubleshooting piece. Okay. So what I wanted to do now, because this is the basic information we wanted to go over, what I want to do is create an application and add some routes to it. Okay, so I started off by running create React app. So that's actually happening in the first line here. Create React app. We created the router app. And the reason why I ran that ahead of time is it takes 2 or 3 minutes because it also does an npm install of a bunch of packages, as you see here. So it installed these different packages that are required for the base application. Okay, and I'll just scroll down to the bottom of that. Let's see where I get to that page up. Okay, yeah, it doesn't like me scrolling here. Okay, yeah, so it comes down here, gives you your information. But what we want to do is we actually want to run the app. And when you do create React app, you can run the app with npm or node package manager start. Okay, so that's going to start up the basic starter application. Okay, now remember there was some other things that we needed to do in order to get this to work with the router. Okay, so let me just do this. So we're going to open up a second command prompt. Okay, so let's go there, router app, and we're going to open it up in that directory. What we want to do here is to install React Router DOM. So we can do that while it's running. That's fine. That'll work okay. So npm install React Router DOM and then -- save to save it to our package.json file. Okay. So we'll do that. While we're doing that, we'll go take a look at the application. So it should be at localhost 3001. Okay, this is the application here that we just started, and we're installing the router to it. Okay. What we also want to do is we want to open up an IDE that we can work in. So we're going to open up Visual Studio Code. And we're going to open up that directory. File, open folder. And this is router app that we just created. Now the first thing that we need to do is just, we don't need the application that they have, the standard application, so we're going to need to adjust that a little bit. So we go to source here, and we're going to actually create a components directory. And we're going to move a bunch of things in there. So we're going to move app.css in there, move app.javascript, going to move app.test, and the last thing is this logo. Okay, move all those things in there. And of course, when we do that, it's going to fail. And that's okay. That's what we expect at this point. So we're going to open up our index.js, and we're going to change the location where it's importing the app from, add components to it, and it should come back to life. Okay, so it comes back. Okay, now we can start kind of working with this. Let's go to the app. Okay, and we don't need their application here, so we're going to replace that with a minimal app that we're going to build up. Okay, so we're going to replace this with just what you see here. Okay, and this should be a React app. And the last thing, we're just not going to need this logo anymore, so we can get rid of that to be clean. Okay, so now we also want to have a couple of components. So let's copy in some components, and then we'll take a look at them, just so that we don't have to create them from scratch. We'll grab them from here and drop them into components. Drop this in, copy that in, and we'll take a look at it. And we'll copy an about component too, and then we'll take a look at both of those. Okay, so we have this home component. Okay, and the home component is just going to be a div with h4 tag, and then a little div with this is the home component. So let's take the home component and the about component and add them to the app. We'll do this here. First, of course, we're going to need to import them. So import home from import about. And now we're free to use them in here. And home is going to be the first one, and about the second one. Now we haven't, of course, routed yet. We haven't done anything with routing, but we need a couple of components to route to. So that's why we're doing this. Okay. We have this home component and an about component. Okay. And let's just so to make it clear where the boundaries of these things are, it's good to add a little styling that'll support that. We do that in the index CSS. So in the index CSS, we're going to add this here. Just some styling. I'm not going to go over the styling. We'll just add it. You'll see what it does, though. And you'll notice that the setup that we have is kind of nice. It will restart everything once we save any of the files. So now we have two components here, home component and about component. We can see that they're separate, and we don't necessarily want them on the screen at the same time. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to implement routing so that we can route from one to the other. So we're going to add, we're going to go back to the app, and we're going to add our imports for the React router. Okay, so let's take a look at that. We have import browser router and route from React Router DOM. That's all we're going to need to start with. And then we're going to change these. Instead of having home and about, well, I guess the first thing we need to do is add browser router here. And then after it, remember, it can only hold one component. So it's holding the div, okay, that you see here. So that works fine. Now we're going to replace home with a route, and we're going to replace about with a route. Okay, so that they're only going to be activated if the route is what is in the address bar. So here we have the route /home, and it's going to bring up the home component. Now we're going to put in the, instead of about, we're going to have a route that can bring that up conditionally, and then we'll save all that and see what happens. Now, what we'll notice, and this is what we expect actually, is that we don't see anything. Okay, so why is that? We don't see anything because if we look up in the address bar, we have the root path, but we don't have anything after it. And the paths that we're looking to match are either home or about. So if I go up here to the address bar and type in home, it'll actually show the home component. If I go up there and type about, it'll show the about component. Okay, so that's what we want. Okay, but we want an easier way to do that. We don't want to have to type into the address bar. Okay, so what we'll do is we're going to add a navigation section. Okay, and actually before we do that, let's add a redirect. Redirect from the root, so that from equals root, and then to equals, and we'll make that home. Okay, we'll save that. Now it's going to give us an error. So what error do we think it's going to give? It says redirect is not defined. Okay, well that's just because we didn't import it. So we can import redirect because it's part of the React Router DOM. And now it should come up. And if we go back to just showing the root, okay, that goes by a little quick. If I delete that, okay, and just put that there and I hit enter, it's actually going to change from the root to the home component and show the home component. Okay, so the redirect is working. Okay, so now we're going to add some navigation so that we can move between these things by navigating instead of typing in. So we're going to do that with this nav component, which I'm going to bring in. And we're going to add, oops, I need to first open up this. Now we're going to add nav as a component. Now it doesn't have to be added as a component. We're just doing that because it's easier to work that way. Here we create a component called nav. Okay, and nav is going to have some nav links. And you notice that we import Nav Link. Then we have Nav Link down here. Okay, remember the difference between Nav Links and links, right? What Nav Link will do is it'll let you style the navigation link. Okay, so this is just going to add this section. So let's save that and add it into the app.js. So we need to import it. Import this nav from nav.js, and then we're going to add it. And where should we add it? We'll add it right after this header here. Nav, and see what that looks like. Okay, so now we have a home and about. Click on home, it stays at home. Click on about, it goes to the about. Okay, so we can go between those two. Okay. Then we've got a little bit of extra styling for that too. We'll add that in there, which is just add this here at the end so that they show up as what looks more like buttons now. Okay. So we have home and about. So maybe what we want to do now is take advantage of the fact that this is a nav link. Okay. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to hit F12 and open up our developer tools. Okay. There's two things that we'll fix here. Maybe we should fix this first. We get this error. It says, warning, you tried to redirect to the same route that you're currently on, home. So this is when we're on the home, and then it sees that the redirect redirects from the / to home. It doesn't like that because of the fact that we haven't wrapped what we have here with the switch element. So switch is going to tell it to just do one of these things as opposed to possibly more than one of them. Okay, so we do switch, but again, we need to add switch up here in the import also. Okay, so now it should come up without the error. Okay, and we can click, and it doesn't have any problem because it's only trying to match one of the routes in the set. Okay, the next thing we want to do is add some styling. So what we can do here is take a look at, say, the home button, And when we look here, it's maybe a little hard to see, but it says class equals active, and that's on the home button. Okay. Now, if I click on the about button, well, you notice that class equals active has been removed from the home button and been added to the about button. Okay. So now we know that if we add an active class to our CSS, then we should be able to see that styled. Okay. So we're just going to add that piece there. We'll go to our CSS. And this is the main CSS for the whole application. You know, you could add it in different places, but this it'll definitely work from here. So we're just going to add active, font weight bold, color green. Okay, and it's already taken place over here. I click on home, and it finds that style, and it styles the Nav Link. Click on about, it styles that. Okay. So let's close out some of these. So that's what a basic routed application looked like. Let's see, there's a question here. Somebody's asking about the slides. I believe that the information, the slides were passed out in an email, but I can drop them into the handouts section here. So let me do that real quick so that they'll be there. React Router chapter and the webinar agenda, we'll drag them there. We need to do it one at a time. And so now, okay, so React Router. So both of those PDFs are now in the handout section if you want to download them. Okay. There's another question here. What about if we want to open About Me in a new tab? Okay. If you're opening it in a new tab, you're actually instantiating the application separately. That would be something you could do with. You can do that with certain anchor links by setting properties of the anchor link. Okay, so that's not something that is specific to the React router. You just do it in the same way that you would do it for HTML, for any HTML page. But what it's going to do is it's actually going to create a new instance of the application. So you can't open up a separate tab that's in the same application. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at, I just want to show you this application here, which is the more full-featured version of what we just created. It's got a couple more features that are interesting that we might want to take a look at. And we will open that code so we can look at it. We'll just spend a couple minutes on that. So here we have the home and the about like we did before. But this now just, you know, this is a separate application in a separate directory that just happens to have these other features already filled in. We just don't have time to create them from scratch. Okay, but what I wanted to show you is this one here first, which is the send mail. Send mail just happens to be a, if we move this here so we can see it better, because we have to see that it's got parameters here, okay, or query parameters. And those query parameters are going to be passed into this component that are shown on the screen. So currently it's name equals John, and the email goes with that. So if I change this from John to Cindy, and I change this here from John, we should see it change in the down here. Okay, so we see that when we change the parameters up here on the address bar, it gets changed down here. Okay, so we can take a look at how that works by looking at this send mail. This is the send mail component. So if we went into here under components, went into send mail, the big important thing here is just how does it retrieve that data? Okay, and we see that it retrieves that data. Let's see. It goes through. I'll open this up more. It gets it from props, location, search. That brings back the whole string. It gets parsed by URL search parameters, passed into params. This is all being done in the constructor for this component. And then we get the name here into name, and we get the email, and we put it into this .email. So now we have two properties that are properties of the class itself. So we address them with this.name and this.email, so that when we go down into the template or the JSX code, that's how we retrieve them. Okay, because they're not specifically part of the properties of the props object. Okay, they're part of the class, so they get use this to get to them. Okay, the other thing that you probably want to see is here, if we go to a list page, we can show the use of route parameters. So if we click on an item like gloves, it goes to the details page, so it routes to the details page. But it brings up a specific item, the gloves, which are the ones that we wanted. And the way we can tell it's going to do that is it has this route parameter up here. If I change that route parameter to 3, it's going to bring up whatever was on the third thing on the list. Okay, so this information is getting passed to the detail component. Okay, so we want to take a look at how the detail component reads that. So we get product details down here, and then we can do this again, give us more space. Okay, in this case, we see that we can pull it right out of params. This should probably be called props. It can be called whatever you want, but generally it's called props. In this case, it was called params. But think about that as your props object that gets passed into your component, and props.match.params is going to be the object that holds all the route parameters. And the one route parameter that we've set is the index. Index is going to be that value 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's going to be put into index. We're going to use that by passing it to the array. So we have a products array that's part of the state. We pass whatever that number is, and it brings the selected product. Now that we have the selected product, in this case we're just setting it up as a regular variable because we're not inside of a class-based component. It's just a regular functional component. So we can set it up as a property, as a variable, and then just access it like that. Selected product.name, selected product.description. That's what you see here. Here's the name, here's the description. And then we have an image tag that gets its source from selected product.image. That's the image that you see down in the lower right. Okay. So the key to this is this part up here, getting the index value. Okay, so we have a few minutes left. I wanted to see if anybody had any questions. We could go over those. You can ask questions by going into the questions area of the webinar. Okay, well, let's see, we'll go back to here. So we'll leave you right here on our last slide. I want to, let's see, oh, we do got a question here. Okay, so the demo code, I have to check with, we have somebody who administers the webinars, check to see if they can send out the code. I have it in a zip file. I would put it in the handout section of the webinar, but the handout section will not handle zips, right? It rejects zips. You can't do that. So there's a question here about Angular. I haven't worked, Angular, okay. How does React compare with Angular? Okay, the overall picture between those two is they're both really good methods of creating single page applications. Okay, Angular happens to be a full framework, which means it includes things like network retrievals, and it includes the routing, it includes all these things that you need to create the application. React, on the other hand, React is the component part, and you add to React any other libraries or packages that you need. Okay, so you can have one person or one development department using React with certain other packages, packages A, B, and C, and somebody else using it with packages, E, F, and G. Okay, so with React, you can think about that as in either positive or negative terms, right? The having to choose those other packages could be something you don't want to deal with. If that's the case, you can use Angular and it includes everything in it. But React, on the other hand, you can think about the fact that it doesn't lock you into certain other packages, and you can choose them at will based on what you want to do. Okay, that's kind of the overall look at those two. Okay, so thanks again for attending the webinar, and another question's come in. Okay, in Visual Studio, okay, so when you're using the full Visual Studio package, as opposed to Visual Studio Code, there are some shortcuts to creating these applications. Like we used Create React App. Okay, so there's a lot of people who are, work with different editors use that way to create a React app. But you can use a like a shortcut inside of Visual Studio in order to do that. It really comes down to what works best for you. If you use what's in Visual Studio, then if you have any issues with it, then you have to just deal with that through the Visual Studio ecosystem. Go to those websites that you can get those questions answered. Whereas you might find that some of the other methods for creating a React application, there is more answers for things like from Create React App out on Stack Overflow. Okay, so it really comes down to that. Is it more convenient to use one or the other? No, they both work about the same way. But if you want support for them, okay, you want to go with whichever one you feel like you have the best support. Now, of course, with Visual Studio, there's two things. Visual Studio, the full Visual Studio package, that's what we're talking about. It has its own ways to create these applications, React and Angular. And Visual Studio Code is just a separate standalone editor that's used. That's the one that I used here. You don't have to load the whole Visual Studio to use that. Okay. So we've run out of time. Again, thanks for attending. We do have some classes that if your organization's interested, you can check us out on the web, Web Age Solutions, get some more information about that.